session. This is a session that we started literally 17 years ago. We've been doing this every single event since we started LA Games Conference. And it is our panel called The View from the Top, the State of the Industry. And the mix is always different each year. And we have an outstanding group. So let me introduce them and invite them onto the virtual stage. David Stelzer is UE Business Director of Games at Epic Games. Welcome, David.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great to have you here. And Andy Swanson, Head of Publisher Relations at Mod.io. Andy, welcome.
Thank you much. Wonderful to be here again, Ned.
Good to see you. Seth Gerson, CEO of Survios. Seth, great to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
And Mike Moorehouse, who's usually the moderator, but is a panelist this time, CEO of Moorehouse Advisors. Great to have you, Mike.
Fun, thank you.
And our moderator is Julie Shoemaker, SVP of Revenue at Unity. Julie, take it away.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, Ned. Welcome, gentlemen. And today we're going to go by Jules' rules. So Mike normally moderates, but today I'm taking over the helm, and we'll hopefully keep this crew on track and robust conversation. I'm going to give a tiny snapshot of the context of the great panelists we have here. I'm going to start with David, runs global business development at Unreal. He has been at Epic since 2015, so obviously has had a wild and amazing ride. David was also in charge of games at CAA for the games group in CAA, so much of the amazing IP that we probably all enjoyed, he had his hands in. David began his career in the music industry. After attending law school, he was at business affairs at House of Blues Entertainment, and then GC at Sega. So I guess you'd call that old school in the games business. Welcome, David. Next is another old school games guy, Andy Swanson. Andy started in magazines with PC Gamer. He was there for 9 years while he was denying the internet was a real thing. He then went on to Ubisoft, convinced them that ads were interesting, licensing, and e-commerce, and ultimately got Ubisoft onto Steam. Pretty much Andy's been through most of the cycles, from Twitch, where you watch, play, through now Mod.io, where you make play. And welcome, Andy. Next is Seth Gerson. Seth is CEO of Survios. Seth is a serial entrepreneur, currently managing all assets of the virtual reality software development. And he also started at Sega in product development and marketing, went on to Activision, Universal Studios, co-founded Pocket Soul, who sold to Turner and became Play On Sports. Also co-founder and CEO of All Ego. So it's wonderful to have such a serial entrepreneur on the panel. And finally, I'll end with Mike Moorehouse. Again, quite shoes for me to fill today. Mike founded Moorehouse Advisors. I've personally participated in many partnerships with companies he's impacted and grown over the years. He also ran the digital in gaming practice at Magid, where he co-founded that or founded that. Mike is on the board of directors of Perion. He often helps our industry on everything from CNBC through Fox and New York Times and et cetera. So Mike, welcome, and I'm very excited to get a chance to interview you. Okay, let's make this happen, gentlemen. We're going to hit a few common themes. The frame of our session is the view from the top. The global game market topped 184. Global games market topped 184 million in 2020. Did I misread that? Must have been billion. Anyway, we're big. We're a very big category, right? We are experiencing all kinds of growth, and yet at the same time, we wake up every morning and hear doomsday about the economy. We see the market pulling back on investments by naming, the end of the pandemic's impact on games. And so the panelists, we're going to help the world understand what you all think from your seats in this awesome industry. I'm going to hit with David and Seth, I'm going to have you dive in on the first area, which we're going to talk about multi-platform. Since we all go back in this industry, you can remember when, now I wasn't on the playground, but certainly playground-like debates about which console was going to win, which one was better. And certainly the trends for our players is that it's all about multi-platform, cross-platform play. And so the question is, what do you think that the impact is on the space? How would you guide as content producers, as consumers across that chasm? And David, I'll kick it off to you.
Sure. I think multi-platform has definitely evolved over time, and we're really seeing a time now where I think it's really come to a head. You had for a long time where you might have had a PC developer who that was kind of their thing. They would make a game for PC. They would see how that game did on PC, and then they would move it out to other platforms through Porthouse or anything like that. Just try to slowly make sure that they could build and kind of have that market available to them. And they would use the funding from one to fund into the next, et cetera. And that happens with console as well, as they move from maybe the main console players from like a Sony and a Microsoft to expand out into Nintendo or something like that. But kind of the trend that we're seeing now is to be everywhere at the same time when you release. So a simultaneous release of being on every console that you can, being on PC. And even we're seeing mobile as a simultaneous release, which is a new and interesting trend, right? So mobile used to be one of those things that was either a lead platform, and then we would see people moving from mobile into the console and PC space, or vice versa. And you would really have to change that game around in order to make it work for one or the other, and it might not have been the same experience. But we're getting a lot of players now who are looking to kind of build for everywhere at the same time, and having people being able to play everywhere at the same time. I think cloud players are making that more of a possibility as we see things like what xCloud is doing and whatnot. But it's definitely something where we hear a lot from the developers that how do we capture the greatest audience at once? And this is necessary, I think, as a lot of companies are pushing free to play out into the marketplace. They need that scale as they come in. But they want to make sure that everybody has some sort of parity, is having the same type of experience regardless of where they're playing. And that's kind of a trend that I've seen building over the course of the last year.
And Seth, just as a build on that, what do you think the impact to the consoles, the platforms themselves, if any?
Yeah, so maybe if I unpack that from your first question about sort of inflation, if you take a step back and you look at just premium content in video games, since 1995, the price of a game for premium content has remained the same. It's hovered around $60, right? It has on an inflation adjusted basis. It hasn't really changed. Now the consoles have kind of gone up and down depending on the different consoles on an inflation adjusted basis. So in terms, but what you do have is in terms of that content, you have a lot more value for the consumer. So if you go back and you look at, you mentioned the size of the video game market, film by comparison, I think is about 45, $46 billion, right? So video games have grown significantly, but they're eating the rest of the entertainment ecosystem. So the consumer is getting a lot more value. And then when it comes to crossplay, where that value is really increased for the consumer, it almost, you have to look at the genre, right? So if you look at something like a battle royale game, right? Battle royale games, they need a large liquidity of eyeballs because you have to put a large group of users together so that they can go in, and then you have to sort of rank them based on their skill levels. If you look at a game, even more so like Creed, right, which is one of our games that you put out, we need a large liquidity of eyeballs on the multiplayer space because you can only match two people at the same time, and you need to match them by skill level. So certain games, they require a higher liquidity of eyeballs, and the easiest way to do that is by having full crossplay and being able to connect platforms. That does get a little more complicated because if I'm on an Xbox or a PlayStation 5, I can press a button, versus if I'm in VR, I actually have to physically throw a punch. So you have to make sure to keep the actual creative where it can be fair among that cross-platform. So all the games aren't made for that, but it's certainly by linking more users, you're giving more intrinsic value to the games, which is why I think games are such, a great value to the individual consumer.
Can we assume that cross-platform is now just the de facto? I mean, I don't mean to be, I feel like 4 years ago we were arguing Fortnite and Rocket League and making sure that the players could play. It seems like that ship has left the orbit a little bit there's still things like console exclusives and money being pumped into it. But to me, I feel like the consumers and the game developers and the game publishers of the world are open to cross-platform. And the platforms are opening up. We're seeing Xbox, we're seeing PlayStation. It seems to me like now it's fine-tuning. How do we make it better? How do we make it a good experience? Your point was, how do we make it easier for the different games? And so, I think like cross-platform
is it economic? Because if it is a foregone conclusion, the data doesn't show it, right? 59% of American male players last year played a cross-platform multiplayer. So it's a lot, it's huge, but it's not everyone. It's not every game. So is it the economics, or is it just adoption of the genres that matter for cross-platform?
I think it's the genres that matter. I mean, again, you need, for these big free-to-play games, you need that scale of players coming from everywhere. You need that critical mass of players in that field of the Call of Duties of the world and the Fortnites of the world and Rocket Leagues. Looking at that, it would be more interesting to see through those lenses and those games, which of those players play cross-platform. And Andy, to your point, I think the players have been open to it and wanting it for years, right? Whether it's a portability of playing where they want to play, when they want to play it, et cetera. But it's been, the consoles and the platforms that for a long time were resistant to it. And those walls are pretty much broken down now. You really don't see a fight over that anymore.
I agree with Andy and Dave. I think the most notable exception is really highly tight narrative-driven content.
Sure.
And the reason I think that's the most notable exception also is because those games tend to over-index on production budgets, and those are the games that the first parties tend to drive the most marketing dollars into to move hardware. Because you don't buy a PlayStation 5 because you like the silicon inside it. You buy it because you want to play a particular title.
But you also see that's where the console exclusives tend to be, right?
Yep.
You're in that narrative driven because you can play a single player and just drive through that console. But as you get more into a driven multiplayer game, you're not seeing a lot of those being console exclusives because they need that audience. They need to feed it.
So I'm going to hit on the economic side of all of this, because I think Seth teed us up with such a great stat, as pertains to 20 years ago, the cost of a packaged product hasn't grown. And yet when we talk about, cross-platform multiplayer, we're talking about, significant back-end costs for a publisher developer. So Mike, when you think about the economic shifts in our space, the cost to run games, always on games, where do you see this going? Who's going to bear the brunt? Oh, you're on mute.
I do think with all this artificial intelligence and machine learning, it would just naturally, unmute me or something. Look, I think everybody on this panel is going to agree. It just costs a lot more to run a game company today. It costs a lot more to run a game. Now, the balance side is you've got games going, 10, 15, 20 years. But it seems like the price for the big boys has gotten huge. These purchases they've made are all very, very expensive. Maybe the Zynga one to a lesser extent, but some of the others. So it's harder for the small guys, unless they've done it before, to raise money. It's very hard to do a cross-platform. It's impossible to do a cross-platform multiplayer MVP.
Mm-hmm.
And then so the business is getting more expensive and harder to do, harder for the small teams to do it. And until just recently, valuations have been soaring. Now they're kind of almost collapsing, I might say. I think collapsing is an overstatement. And so you've got this really, it's funny, the gaming economic world kind of looks a lot like the stock market. It's very volatile right now. A lot of winners, a lot of losers.
So I'm gonna hand this back to Seth and Andy, you chime in too. So you hit a really important point. We have just in 3 deals, $85 billion exchange, right? Just in Activision, Bungie, and Zynga acquisitions. So 73% more live operation games are run by big publishers. 73% of all live ops. I mean, it's pretty crazy, right? So what are the economic impacts to an up and coming entrepreneur? I mean, Seth, you're an entrepreneur. If you were starting a game company right now, what would you be doing?
Look, I completely agree with what Mike was saying. A big piece of this is scale matters, and being able to raise a significant amount of capital matters. But at the same time, the stakes are much higher. If you look at games right now, traditional gaming is about, for the consumer, it costs about 73 cents an hour versus a movie is $7.11 an hour. So when you look at the actual cost of games, it's very, very inexpensive for the consumer to go out and play, and it's very cost effective. But that sort of means on the capital side, you have to kind of figure out how am I going to raise money? And at the end of the day, you're trying to raise the cheapest form of capital. And so as we see interest rates going up, debt is less of an option. Venture debt becomes prohibitively expensive, and you have to start to look at other types of financing options. PE has notably gotten much more aggressive in the space, and VC used to never take sort of single hit content risk, and there's a lot of that going on now.
There is a ton, and I'm going to actually buck that trend a little bit that Mike and Seth are talking about, and say, going back to when I was at CAA, you had companies that were trying to raise a fund, right? Going back to the early Tilting Point days, and they wanted to raise a AAA content fund that was just going to support the big guys in the industry, and that was the way it was going to be before free-to-play broke. Now you have, just doing some rough math in my head without stating any of the names on the PE and the VC side, you've got at least $5 billion in capital that's sitting out there waiting to be deployed. And it's going to all these people who are leaving the large AAA companies and deciding that they want to reboot themselves and start things up. And that capital is readily available. Now, you have capital being available fairly readily, but that capital is not going to get a game to release or get it over the finish line. They're there. The investments are highly going into platform plays, UGC plays, et cetera. And it's just to get to the building blocks of it to prove out that this can be done. But eventually they're going to have to either take on a ton more capital in order to get to the finish line and get that thing out the door and then market it and build the community and build the scale, or they're going to have to take some sort of publishing partner on in the large scale of the people who know how to do it and have the large bankrolls to do it. So in that regard, I think like checks are just being handed out at this point. It's easy for somebody to go and start their company. What will happen to most of those as they try to build and get to scale and run through those funds, I think is like a year or 2 years from now, where we're going to see how things change, especially based on the challenges in the market right now, the stock market.
Totally.
That's interesting stuff, David. So I want to expand on a point you made with a question to Andy and maybe bring it a little bit back to the player. So your point was, we've got this shift. We have even UGC, and on the heels of Mike's comment about you can't do an MVP in a massively multiplayer, multi-platform game.
Yeah.
So what's the shift, Andy, and how is that going to affect both the player, but also the cost of content?
Totally. It's a really great question. And I think that the point earlier was look, we've gotten to the point where it used to be a $60 box, right? A $60 box bought at retail. We're all framed in that space. It still residually has that. The reality is a $60 box is not the case anymore. Most of it's digital. Most of the content's being acquired digital. A lot of the content is actually being acquired and played after launch. We have DLC, we have season passes, we have skins, we have all kinds of things. And so the content pipeline of a post-launch has become way more important than it ever has before. We used to launch a box and move on, and now it's not that. So you talk about the mechanics. To David's point, a lot of that money that's going to the those guys that are starting their things, a lot of those have UGC, user-generated content, or modding, whatever you want to call it, as a pillar of their business model, right, as they're building. Because they know that in order to scale, they've got to have a content pipeline that matches against what some of these big guys can produce. And they're probably unable to do it within their own house. So they're looking for a variety of ways to do it. So that's one of the things that we're seeing in UGC is how do we use these creators as fulfilling content is an interesting piece. And that changes the dynamics and the economics as well. I think that is something that, again, we talk about the ever-evolving changes in the space. We talked about free-to-play. Well, free-to-play used to be something that was unknown and a bad word, not a bad word, but it was scary. Not every game that's gone in the free-to-play market has succeeded. Some have succeeded, some have retreated. We've lived the MMO gold rush, right? We wave 1.0 of in-game ads gold rush. We've lived the esports gold. So a lot of these things require a concept like needing content in the pipeline with an established way of doing it, UGC, and people coming together to agree that this is what's in the best for the industry. I think we could agree cross-platform is best for gamers, cross-modding is probably best for gamers, UGC is best for gamers. Whether the platforms and the developers come to the table is oftentimes where video game opportunities come to either succeed or die. And that's that thing where we're like, are we coming to the table so that we can all win, or are we coming to the table so that it's an I win, you lose situation?
And as you build up a UGC economy, like the efficiency of capital is really great there because you're using that capital to build out this pipeline of tools that you're going to give to a group of creators. But at the same time, you're building a certain amount of first-party content to drive the community to you. And the goal is that at some point, you can reduce the amount of first-party content you're making as the UGC and community content takes over. And then you just become a distributor of that content around that thing that you've created, as opposed to having to create new content all the time. You keep your tools up to date, you provide the back-end infrastructure, payments, store, all of those types of things. And I think those are going to be really important things that drive that economy in the future.
And I'm going to kind of hit on the cross of the player advantage and the economy advantage at the same time, and might kind of take you back to the data that we've all seen over and over again. Over 50% new players to gaming since, or 50% increase in total player base since the beginning of the pandemic, 30% increase in revenues across the board for the last 2+ years. And now the market, we don't see the trends in actual usage, but there's a fear that with life normalizing a bit more, that we're going to plummet. So what do you think is going to happen on the player side? Are they going to stick with our category? The pandemic players here to stay? Is the revenue here to stay? And how would you guide us on your thoughts on the economy of it?
Well, it's not a worry. It's a fact. Matter of fact, I just got off the phone with a major mobile game company, and they anticipate that their growth rate is going to be about a third of what it was the last 2 years. And you hear this on a number of levels, kind of back to what it was when they started COVID, or a little bit above, and probably a 10 to 15% total CAGR around revenue being picked up by increasing whale behavior. You're definitely seeing some free-to-play drop off in the larger, base of people buying IAP. But what's interesting is that individual games break through and are huge, and that's what drives some of the big numbers you were talking about. It's not driven by the 10% of people that are playing games today that weren't playing 3 years ago. It's driven by big hits with big whales, whether they're paying whales or they're playing whales. And so that, 20%, 10% is getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
Isn't it interesting, the semantics? I mean, even even the way we present the data, we're still growing more than pre-pandemic rates. We're just going to grow at lower rates than the last 2 years. Is that what I'm hearing?
Which makes sense for a variety of reasons, including the macro movement, the long-term secular movement was in that direction. When you get to 15 billion IAP in the United States on mobile, it's got to slow down. But you know what else is happening is you've got brand new types of games breaking through, and internationally those numbers are even bigger. And so those games are creating new people and new players. And, of course, I'm talking about NFT games and other sorts of games like that. And if you include real money gambling, which is growing, real gaming, real money gambling, social casino, casual, mid-core, core, multi-platform, multiplayer. These are, 5-10 hits a year that nobody had even thought would happen 2 years ago.
Yeah. So, hey, I'm going to pick up on a word Andy said, which was hey, we've kind of, we've been through the in-game ad thing. We've been through this component. We've moved to IEP from digital downloads. So when we think about these, what is old is new again, right? How would you, as a panel, I'm gonna put David. I'll throw this to you, and you're welcome to grab any of your colleagues here who you want to join in the answer. But if we think what is old is new again, and we think blockchain, we think NFTs, et cetera, how do they correlate to the economic models we used in the past, and how much are they going to get traction, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a good way to put it. So as things started to come online of blockchain, NFT, and there is a craze right now, obviously in the capital markets that a lot of money is going into that. It's definitely a buzzword right now. But when we look at from an engine standpoint and the technology that we're giving to people to use, does it make a difference if you're making an NFT game? Does it make a difference if you're making a blockchain game? And not really. What we're finding is a lot of these things are business models and business model add-ons. Some people are grabbing it because it is the buzzword, but some people are realizing that there is a real utility to what they're making. And I think that what you'll start to see is successes pop out based on people using the utility the correct way. But to get more direct to the answer for your question, like old is new, we're seeing the same patterns that we saw when free-to-play broke out in mobile gaming, right? And it was all of a sudden, it was like, oh, this is terrible. This is terrible for kids. We're causing, kiddie slot machines and gambling and all this stuff. And it ended up becoming the de facto way of doing business. It became a great UAP tool. And it just became a way for games to break out into the market that otherwise probably wouldn't have been seen. I think you're going to start to see that same thing. We have a little bit of a different mechanic here with play to earn, but that's been going on in Eastern Europe and in Asia for a long time. You've had play to earn that's been operating there in the PC space for a very long time, and in mobile. We're just starting to see more of it. We're just not accustomed to it, I think, in the West as much.
I think to your point, David, also is everybody assumes when there's something new that it's 100% market traction. So like you mentioned, free-to-play. Free-to-play has found its space. But that doesn't mean all gamers play free-to-play or all major hits are free-to-play. It just means there is a space for free-to-play to be successful, right? Just like I think we're arguing there is a place for NFT and crypto to be successful down the line. It's just not going to be the end-all be-all. We still have to remember, we've got great single-player games. There's still a lot of games that are out there that can be incredibly successful without the additional. Now, that also means that those new opportunities need to go through the ringer a little bit. That when we say, well, what's old is new, it just simply means the old stuff has kind of gone through the ringer, right? We've tested it. We've battle hardened it. We've gone through cloud gaming. Now we've had 4 cloud gaming things that have come out between OnLive, Gaikai, Amazon, and Google coming out with this product, and it still hasn't settled. It doesn't mean the idea is bad. It just means we haven't quite figured out the right mix yet. And when you find that mix, and that's oftentimes what a gold rush is how much can we extract out of this opportunity before it tempers, settles, and becomes mainstream. But I tend to agree with you.
Seth, are you comfortable saying, are you going to be adopting some of the new economic models?
Was that to me?
Seth, sorry, Seth.
Yeah, look, for us, the blockchain is nothing more than another payment system, right? It's another payment methodology. The difference is where I think this one's really interesting, just old is new, right? Go back, 15, 10 years ago. And if you kind of think about it, physical distribution got disintermediated, right? Especially in the United States by the box stores. This is the same thing. I mean, in Europe, it's still highly fragmented, but in Asia and in North America, you've still got sort of that same ecosystem now, and it's you've got a couple of box stores that matter. Blockchain's the same thing, but the difference this time around, and where I think it makes a huge difference, is if you put in the hashtag that you're the beneficiary, the whoever made that content, for every time you have a secondary sale, that publisher or developer can take somewhere between 5 and 30% of that transaction of the secondary sale. Mm-hmm. So if you go and you look at the total size of the game market, it's probably somewhere between 5 and 30% larger than most of what sell side puts out these days. So I think it's highly interesting. Now, for the first parties, I think there are a couple of issues that have to kind of get worked out of the system. Number one, there's not a lot of clarity from the regulators. So the regulators have to give some clarity. Number two, there has to be everything from like KYC, right, to money laundering to is this a financial instrument? Mm-hmm. So I think that worries them. But the minute the first parties can connect a wallet, all of a sudden you kind of blow open the door on being able to make a lot more money for that content. So we do have a couple of projects in the works that do take advantage of that. We're very excited about that technology and what it brings. Probably less on the play to earn for our particular customer. And then the other thing I would say, old is new, is VR has really blown up in terms of just number of units sold. That's now a console into itself. So you've got a new console out there that a lot of people just aren't taking advantage of as well. So I think there's a lot of places where if you're going out and you're raising capital and you're trying to start a game, there are a lot of places you can play that are relatively protected from the bigger players who are on more of a wait and see approach.
So Seth, I liked how you picked up on the IP owner participating downstream, right? Secondary markets, et cetera. So Seth, I'm going to ask you this question. You might not be able to answer it. So if you aren't able, because of your role at Epic and Unreal, that you would want to punt to Mike, please do. So I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm sorry, David. So David, where do you see blockchain, if you think about how many people view Fortnite, right, on Twitch and Discord, various other, YouTube, et cetera, where do you see blockchain bringing back the downstream economics of viewing?
So I'm going to take it out of the Fortnite conversation because I don't really work on that side of the business. But from an Unreal and third-party licensee standpoint, the way that our business model works is that we participate in the success of our developers. And so as those tools get distributed and people make stuff with those tools, right, we will work with the developer to figure out what a model looks like that is fair in the process, to be able to look at how revenue gets distributed. I think as we look at the open metaverse more so down the line, these types of things become much more relevant, and we're starting to really just think about frameworks for that right now. So for blockchain's a very nebulous word, right? Like, which blockchain is going to come out on top here? Has that blockchain even been thought of? Which smart contracts are going to be used? Are they the smart contracts that exist today, or will they be different? How do we work with people where, they're just a payment processor for things that are moving forward? There's a lot of legal issues that come into play in this space that are still being sorted out and very complicated. The interoperability pieces, will that content be portable in actuality, and how does it work between things? So we as tool makers look at it as, yes, we would love to work with developers figure all of these things out. I don't think anything is restricted as long as it doesn't run afoul of the law, but I don't think we've really figured out what that means in every situation yet. It's really case by case at this moment.
Good, thanks, David. So Mike, there's a question in the Q&A. Can you just weigh in on what you think the traction that NFTs in gaming might achieve or not?
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, since it's been a hot topic, I've put it into a lot of studies, and over I've seen the 18 to 34-year-olds get it. They know the terminology. They've been exposed to it in one way or another. They're open to it, more likely to play games when NFT type enablement exists, more often to believe that there's value to them in playing games. So in this 18 to 34-year-old group, you've got a really good fermentation of people that want to be in these aspects of gaming. I think long-term, it's a real trend. There's no doubt in my mind. I mean, let's just add in collecting. Let's add in bragging. I mean, just things we know that exist in human nature. But short-term, I do think there's some real volatility. I'm in a handful of these companies, and I don't think they're all going to, succeed financially. There's going to be some greater fool theory over some near-term exits. Good for the people that make money on the exit, bad for the people that didn't diversify or only picked one. But some of these games, putting aside the NFT, are just good new game ideas. I mean, there's one that I just love, which is a bee progression game. They haven't built the game, but they've thought a lot about it. The PowerPoint's very thorough. They've got game designers involved, and there are just aspects of it that are fun and, reminds me of, CryptoKitties, but much better. So I think there are going to be some big hits for consumers in this space. And a lot of people are going to make a lot of money long-term. I think the Animoca guys are going to do absolutely great, but the guy spinning it up today, he's probably a little late for the current wave.
Mm-hmm. That's great context, Mike. So I'm gonna answer the next question on the Q&A with a couple framing data points we just found in a study we did of Unity developers. So in the multi-genre success was the study, and 76% of all development is one genre. So that's our data shows that 76% of the developers on the platform build within the context of kind of one genre. And yet if you build for two, 78% higher revenues than if you build for only one. And what we saw, if you build for 3+, 119% more than 2+. So in essence, if you build for 3 or more genres as a developer, you're seeing 197% greater economic success. So when we go to Neil's question with that in mind, right, it takes a lot of resources to build for multi-genre. And Neil says, if you have original game idea, you want to boot it up, do you focus on the IP and the idea, or do you focus on basically analytics or how you run a game? How would you answer that? I'm going to throw that back old school, Andy. I want you to think about the industry and how because Ubisoft did it better than anybody.
I think if you're making a game that's not for the gamer to start with, or the consumer, if you haven't identified your consumer and said, this is the game for this type of person that loves this experience, whatever that is, whether that is shooter, single player, multiplayer, co-op, whether that's RTS, whether that's mouse and keyboard, doesn't matter. Is there an audience that wants this? If the answer is yes, then build a game that scratches that and then add the piece to it. I think if you're going into it, and this is this debate that we have in crypto and NFT, is you're building it for the mechanics, not for the passion or the love of the game, or it's the financial mechanic. That is where you have a real significant risk of failure, because you're going to get somebody that comes in and says, "Oh, I'm excited about this," and then bam, you've smoked me with this I think this is a great genre that I love, but the reality is the mechanics is that I've got to grind and make. So all of a sudden, yuck, you've now taken a thing that I've loved and you've made it icky kind of. And so I still think if you're going in without consumer wants and desires, you're going about it the wrong way. This is entertainment dollars that people want to spend their money to escape and to get out of the world. This is entertainment. So it's got to be entertaining, not simply grindy. So I think it's important.
But your
By the
money,
way, multi-genre games, particularly in the mobile space, attract much more younger players, heavier players, and players, non-white players.
Mm.
Hispanic and African American numbers twice what the overall population is. There's a very interesting play in this mixed genre, particularly again in going after the top.
What are you guys talking about as mixed genre? Give me a game. What is a game that's a mixed genre?
I'll give you an example on a console. Horror survival.
Because it's a shooter and a scary game. Is that why? Okay.
I mean, that's how I'm defining it.
Okay. But you're not seeing like RTS shooters. There's no such thing as an RTS.
I mean, we can argue about what.
Do we build one? Okay, so I love this. How far away are we from living in the metaverse? Oh my gosh, the metaverse. Can't get through a session without the metaverse. So how far away are we from living in Web 3.0 and the convergence of real and virtual?
How do you know we're not already there?
David,
How do we know this is not the matrix?
David, how do we
Going in. I'm going in.
I would argue that we are there. Look,
I'm there.
Nice, Andy. The metaverse means different things to different people. So if you say live in the metaverse, that's a different thing than can we access a metaverse at this time, right? So from an Epic ecosystem standpoint, I would say, we have a metaverse of opportunities here between what Fortnite brings to the table. You have different IPs interacting with the Fortnite IP, and you have all these experiences with concerts and other types of real life experiences that take place in this space. I would say Roblox is doing the same thing, and they've created a metaverse to a certain extent. There's a whole piece to win, brands for the future of helping them create what that digital identity looks like, whether they participate in an existing metaverse or they want to go build their own digital space, and that digital space could be a metaverse. The convergence of all of those things together, that's the hard part years down the road, because getting IP and walled garden owners to cooperate with each other, that you're going to let things roam freely, becomes much harder. There's a lot of technical pieces that still have not been solved yet. But I think the very basics of what we're starting to think of as the metaverse is existing here now. There are tools that are being created. We talked about UGC. UGC is that experience of taking IP that you love, taking tools and building for it. So I think you're starting to see the building blocks here. Now all of the things that make it work properly are going to be built around that. There's a massive infrastructure piece that we never really talk about when we talk about the metaverse in general. And that's the piece to me it's still so far away from being done.
Okay, David, we're almost out of time. So I'm going to have rapid fire. This is view from the top. Where are we headed? One concise thought from each of you. Seth, where are we headed? And you can do it completely selfishly from your own vantage point or from the industry.
I think over the next decade, we're going to see a couple of amazing hardware cycles. And I think the engines are there. So I think the quality of the content gets much better. And I think the quality of the hardware gets much better, and it gets us to where people really feel that metaverse is. Wonderful.
Andy.
I'm going to push my own. I'm a big believer in the creator economy. I definitely am. I think, it's a really important thing that has always been around. When I was back at the publisher of PC Gamer 20 some odd years ago, we were dealing with mods and modders and id and Bethesda, and it has been around. And so I think that the ability to create content and be a part of it has only been that they've been kept at arm's length. And once we can remove that arm's length piece, they've got an army of passionate people that want to create content for brands that they love. And I think once that's unlocked, the first couple people that do that, there's a gold rush we haven't even seen yet in that space.
Wonderful. Sandbox. David.
I pretty much agree with Andy. High quality content that gives you whatever level of fidelity that you want. The tools for the people who love the games and the experiences to be able to create for the masses, essentially making them game makers themselves. And then giving them the tools and the assets and the pieces of being able to do that seamlessly. How do you pull things in to these worlds that you want to build if you're not technically savvy?
Wonderful. Okay, Mike, pressure's on. I know you have 1,000, but you can bring us home.
More platforms, more business models, advertising across platforms and games, and joining in on mod.io, who I adore, is our good friends at Overwolf, the creator economy.
Fabulous. What a great way to wrap this up. Gentlemen, I hope that our panelists had as much fun, or our group had as much fun as the panelists. Thank you for your time. Ned, thank you for the great work you do at Digital Media Wire and at LA Games Conference.
Thank you, Julie, David, Andy, Seth, Mike. Great panel. In fact, you guys got the "you folks are rad" comment from someone in the audience. So you just can't beat that, right?
Probably a cousin of mine.
What's that?
Probably a cousin of mine.
Anyway, you guys were great, and we do appreciate all the engagement from the audience. So please, keep it up, folks. I'm moderating the next panel. It's on investing in the games ecosystem, and we'll start at right at the top of the hour. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you all.
Hey, everybody.